The bus exhaled as it pulled into the sleepy stop just outside Willowfern, the tires crunching over gravel like bones underfoot, and Lyra Hammond stepped down into the pale morning fog with nothing but a violin case and a heart that beat quieter than it used to. The town hadn't changed, but she had, and in the mirror of its unshaken stillness, she felt like a stranger returning to a photograph she no longer fit inside. The main street still smelled faintly of baked bread and damp pavement, and the clock tower still rang its hour 3 minutes too late, a delay that once infuriated her and now felt oddly comforting, like the town's own version of forgiveness. Her boots clicked along the sidewalk past the bookstore that now had a for sale sign, the cafe with the same chalkboard sign, though the letters were shakier now, and the old brick facade of the Willowfern Art Center, which loomed larger in her memory than in real life. She hadn't touched a stage in over a decade. Not since that night. Not since the fall that snapped more than just her wrist. The rumors had followed her even after she vanished, but here, in this quiet town where the past hung in the air like autumn leaves refusing to fall, she hoped they had faded like the music she used to play. She didn't expect anyone to remember her. She certainly didn't expect to be remembered well. So when she stepped through the warped wooden doors of the art center to apply for a part-time admin job, just enough to pay for rent and groceries and maybe a little therapy, she had rehearsed her story, quiet, distant, unobtrusive. A girl who needed paperwork and silence. But the minute she crossed the threshold, she felt it, that low, humming pulse in the walls, in the floorboards, in the chipped paint of the rehearsal halls. It wasn't music, not yet. But it was memory. The receptionist handed her a clipboard and waved her toward the back, explaining that the director would be with her shortly, and Lyra nodded, half listening, heart sinking as she glanced at the framed posters on the wall. Concert season 2012, 2013, 2014, all bearing her name in gold beneath the title lead violinist. Her fingers twitched unconsciously toward the empty air beside her. She still dreamed of notes she could no longer play. She was flipping through the application form when she heard it, soft, melancholic, perfectly measured keystrokes from the grand piano in the main hall. The melody was simple, but full of restraint, the kind of piece that doesn't demand attention but deserves it. It floated down the corridor like a sigh, tentative, precise, full of spaces between the notes where something unspoken lived. She followed it without thinking, clipboard forgotten, each step dragging her further into a past she wasn't ready to greet. And there he was, seated at the piano in a slant of morning light, sleeves rolled up, brows furrowed, hair slightly longer than she remembered. Julian Rivers, the boy whose playing once made her blood boil. The rival who tied with her for the All-State Award and never smiled when he played. The one who didn't flinch when she won, and didn't gloat when she lost everything. Now he was older, sharper around the jaw, softer in the eyes. And still playing like every note cost something. She didn't mean to let the breath slip from her mouth. But he heard it. The music stopped instantly, a single chord hanging unfinished in the air like a held breath. He turned, met her gaze. And for one long moment, they simply stared, two musicians with a symphony's worth of silence between them. Julian's expression didn't shift much, but Lyra could see it. The flicker of recognition, the subtle tightening of his posture, the question he didn't ask. She broke the silence first, but the words were brittle. "I didn't know you still played." He blinked slowly. Then, after a beat, he responded, "I didn't know you still came back." No bitterness. No warmth. Just fact. Lyra's grip on the violin case tightened. The receptionist finally caught up, apologizing for the mix-up, and explained that Julian was the co-director now. A part-time position. Just like the one she was applying for. Apparently, the center had fallen on hard times and was preparing for what might be its final concert before funding ran out. They needed someone to organize the program, schedule practice sessions, manage the outreach. Lyra, desperate, agreed. She didn't look at Julian again. but she felt his eyes on her as she left the room. As if he were already reading the music of her silence. As if he already knew, before even she did, that the distance between them was not made of time, or rivalry, or resentment. It was made of unfinished songs. And now, for better or worse, they would have to finish one. Together. The following Monday brought the first rehearsal planning session, and Lyra arrived early, hoping to claim a corner of the conference room and bury herself in scheduling sheets before Julian showed up. The art center smelled of varnish and wet paint, a recent attempt to hide its age, and the clatter of folding chairs being set up in the recital hall echoed faintly through the corridors like restless memories. She hadn't touched her violin in nearly a year, but even now, the proximity of music made her skin prickle, her fingers curl instinctively, remembering scales like old scars. She spread out the rehearsal calendar on the long table, highlighters at the ready, determined to treat this job like any other. Clinical, logistical, and void of anything personal. But the moment Julian walked through the door, all of that carefully arranged distance felt like it was built from matchsticks. He didn't say good morning, just nodded once and sat opposite her, sliding a folder toward her with practiced ease. His handwriting, as always, was neat to the point of mechanical precision, every note and time slot cleanly underlined, every soloist penciled in with their preferred tempo ranges. Lyra couldn't help but notice that the piano rehearsals were already blocked in around the violinist's schedule, considerate, strategic, or cautious.
She didn't ask.
Instead, she began making changes to the seating chart, grateful that the silence between them had become a kind of shared language. It wasn't angry, just careful. And in that care, there was something quietly respectful. As though they both understood how fragile it would be to speak too directly, to mention the past by name. Still, tension crackled in the room like rosin dust beneath stage lights. Every time their hands brushed reaching for the same page, Lyra flinched, and Julian would withdraw without comment. But not coldly. More like a musician pausing between phrases. At one point, she glanced up and caught him watching her, not judgmental, not amused, just observant. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but instead asked, "Do you still hate Debussy?" His eyes twitched, and for the first time, in what felt like years, he smirked. "Only when it's played badly." She laughed, softly, involuntarily, and for a heartbeat, it was like no time had passed at all. They stayed like that for an hour longer than necessary, tweaking the concert order, arguing over whether a chamber piece deserved a second run, silently agreeing not to program the duet they had once performed in their final year of school, the one that had ended in her collapse and his infamous silence in the wings. Outside, rain tapped the windows like it was tuning an instrument, and when she reached for her coat, Julian finally spoke. "You don't have to pretend you're okay." The words were blunt, but not unkind. Lyra froze. "Excuse me?" He shrugged, not looking up. "You haven't played since you got here. You didn't bring sheet music. Your calluses are gone." She swallowed hard. "Are you checking my hands?" He blinked. "I'm a pianist. I notice hands." She could have snapped. She could have left. But instead, she sat down again and, for the first time, asked him the question she had been holding back since the moment she saw him at the piano. "Why did you stop competing?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than she had expected, because it stopped being about music and started being about proving something to people who didn't matter. He glanced up then, and their eyes locked, and she felt the truth of it settle into her chest like a tuning fork struck too hard. They had both been prodigies once. Now, they were survivors of their own talent. In the days that followed, their rhythm settled into something resembling collaboration, clipped emails, shared spreadsheets, overlapping notes on rehearsal strategy. But beneath every exchange was an unspoken awareness. They were orbiting the same ghost. The ghost of who they used to be, of what they could have been, of the music they had once made together. Not with affection, but with friction so electric it had lit up the stage like fire. And that fire, Lyra realized, was still there. Just quieter now. Smoldering under years of ash. One evening, Julian left a page of sheet music on her desk with a sticky note. Thought you might like this arrangement better. It was a simplified version of their infamous duet, transposed gently, the trickier fingerwork eased without sacrificing tone. She stared at it for a long time. Didn't play it. Just stared. The next morning, she placed it in her drawer. But she didn't throw it away. When the first ensemble rehearsal arrived, Lyra stood at the edge of the hall, clipboard in hand, watching as students tuned and whispered and fidgeted beneath the fluorescent lights. Julian sat at the piano like a mountain, still, deliberate, waiting. She called out section names with practiced authority, guided the tempo, nodded at soloists. And when Julian played the first accompaniment measure, she realized something startling. He had changed his style. Slightly. Subtly. But unmistakably. He was playing softer now. He was listening more. To the silence between notes. To her. The days unfurled like ribbon, slow, uneven, quietly tangled, as rehearsals stretched into late evenings and the first signs of autumn curled through the trees outside the art center's tall, dusty windows. Lyra spent her afternoons surrounded by the clatter of music stands and the warmth of cello vibrations lingering in the floorboards, the soft click of metronomes ticking through second violin parts, and Julian's piano phrases unfurling behind her like shadows that chose to stay. She wasn't playing yet, not officially, but she sat closer to the musicians now, correcting posture, tapping out rhythms with a pencil like she was keeping time for a heartbeat she hadn't heard in years. Every so often, when the others left the hall and only she and Julian remained, surrounded by sheet music and the hush of echoes, a different kind of silence settled. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't charged. It just held things. Sometimes he played, without request or preamble, a passage from Brahms, a few bars of Satie, or the hesitant beginning of their old duet. And Lyra, who hadn't held a bow in nearly a year, began to feel her fingers twitch in time again. She would close her eyes and hear where she used to enter. Hear what used to be hers. One night, after everyone had gone, Julian stayed seated at the piano long after the final chord had faded. Lyra, packing up papers and stray rosin dust from the practice room, asked without turning, "Why do you still play?" His answer came slowly, like someone opening a letter they weren't sure they were allowed to read. "Because when I don't, everything else gets too loud." That silence between them stretched again, but this time it was thinner, warmer, less like distance, and more like restraint. The next morning, a violin sat on her desk. Not hers. A studio loaner. Cleaned. Rest-strung. Ready. No note. Just a knowing kind of silence that made her fingers ache. She didn't touch it. Not for 3 days. Then, one evening, after a particularly fragile rehearsal with the first years, where half the cellists were out of tune and the brass section was 2 beats behind, Julian closed the lid of the piano with a sigh and said, "They're not going to make it through the second movement without a lead." Lyra didn't answer. He waited, then added, "They're following a ghost. They need someone real." Her gaze sharpened. "Is that what I am now? A ghost?" Julian's eyes didn't flinch. "Not to me." That night, she returned to the empty performance hall. And for the first time in years, she opened a case. She tuned slowly, like waking something up after a long sleep. Bow in hand, fingers tight at first, she played a single note. It rang out across the room, imperfect, human, hers. She exhaled shakily, then played another. And another. The sound wasn't flawless, but it wasn't broken either. It was vulnerable. It was alive. Julian entered halfway through the passage, not with fanfare, not with a smile, just a quiet reverence, and sat at the piano. He didn't interrupt, just listened, his hands resting gently on the keys, waiting for the moment to join. She finished her phrase, looked up. He nodded, and without speaking, they began to play. It wasn't the duet. It wasn't even structured. It was something else. Something being made in real time. A conversation. A question asked and answered in notes and rests, in breath and space and sound. Not perfect, not polished, but shared. When it ended, neither of them moved for a long time. Then Julian, voice low, said simply, "You're still in there." Lyra didn't cry, but her hands shook as she packed up the violin again. In the weeks that followed, they didn't speak about that night. But things shifted. They began finishing each other's sentences in rehearsal, sharing coffees without asking, arguing about tempo like it mattered again. They never touched, not yet, but their silences began to say more than their words. And sometimes, when Lyra walked into the hall, Julian would already be there, playing just loud enough for her to hear from the door. A kind of welcome, a kind of waiting, a kind of something neither of them dared name, not yet. By the third week of rehearsals, the musicians had begun to take shape, not just in sound, but in cohesion, like puzzle pieces clicking softly into place under the quiet guidance of two people who barely acknowledged how in sync they had become. Lyra stood at the center of it all, more confident with each passing day, though she never admitted it out loud. Her fingers still trembled before each downstroke, her heart still skipped on certain phrases, but now she moved with the certainty of someone no longer trying to vanish into silence. Julian, ever the enigma, adjusted around her like second nature, not intrusively, not obviously, but with an intimacy that lived in small gestures, moving a music stand without being asked, knowing exactly when she needed a break but wouldn't say it, shifting tempo to catch her when she lost her place in a new piece and pretending he hadn't. They still hadn't spoken about the night they played together, but everything had changed since then, and neither of them seemed ready to admit just how much. The ensemble had become their shared language. She would call for a slow passage, and he would meet her eyes across the room, already changing the pressure of his keystrokes before she could explain. They didn't flirt. They didn't linger. But their closeness began to ripple, small waves in a quiet lake. One afternoon, as the cellists packed up and the brass cleared their music stands, Julian tapped a few notes on the piano absent-mindedly. Lyra looked up from her clipboard and asked without thinking, "Do you remember that winter recital? The one where the power cut out halfway through?" He gave a half laugh, rare and warm. "You kept playing in the dark. Refused to stop." She smiled. "You jumped in. Barely missed a beat." He shrugged. "That was the first time I liked playing with someone." The comment sat between them, quiet but heavy. Not romantic. Not yet. But it glowed like a coal buried under snow. Outside of rehearsals, Lyra began staying later, organizing music sheets, rewriting arrangements. Julian too, though he never explained why. One night, she found him alone in the break room, leaning over a sketch pad, something he never mentioned before. She hesitated at the doorway. "You draw?" He didn't look up. "Sometimes. I used to sketch hands. Then I started sketching sounds." She didn't understand until he turned the pad toward her, a swirl of graphite shapes, sharp and fluid, like music given muscle and curve. She ran her finger along one of the arcs and whispered, "That's my bowing pattern." He finally met her gaze. "I know." Their shared silences deepened. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that carried breath and awareness. One night, it rained, a thunderstorm that shook the roof tiles loose, and she stayed late rechecking the concert lineup while Julian ran scales behind her. The power flickered, and for a moment, the hall was bathed in candlelight. A sudden wind blew open the back door, scattering papers across the floor. Without thinking, Julian reached to catch a stack, and for the first time, his hand brushed hers. She froze.
"So, did he?"
But neither moved away. Their eyes locked, and in the faint glow of stormlight and piano breath, Something undeniable passed between them. Not a confession, but an understanding. And then, just as quickly, he let go. She looked down. He looked away. The spell broken, not shattered, just shelved. The next day, everything returned to normal. Except it hadn't. He brought her tea instead of coffee, saying nothing. She handed him a revised duet piece, transposed for cello and violin. Again, without explanation. They didn't acknowledge what had almost happened. But their music grew tighter.
Softer.
More personal. One evening, she came across an old recording in the back storage room, their high school duet, the one from before her injury. She debated listening, then didn't. Instead, she left it on the piano bench for Julian. No note, just history, quietly returned. Later that night, she received a single text from an unknown number. I listened. You were magnificent. No name, no signature. But she knew. Her hands trembled. She didn't reply. But the next morning, she brought her own violin. No excuses. No shield. Just music. And maybe, the first steps toward something neither of them could define yet. The first wrong note came unexpectedly, not in the ensemble, not on a faulty key or mistuned string, but between Lyra and Julian, and it was all the more jarring because it didn't sound like a mistake. It sounded like hesitation. It was a Tuesday afternoon, rain again misting the windows, and the students had just finished their run-through of the final movement when Lyra stepped forward with a suggestion, a new arrangement that would weave solo sections between the piano and the lead strings, a conversation rather than a showcase. She had stayed up the night before sketching it, fingers sore and ink-stained, nerves frayed but pulsing with something like hope. When she slid the pages across to Julian, her voice quiet but steady, he looked down at the score for a long time without saying a word. And then he said, "It's too ambitious." She blinked. "It's possible." He didn't look up. "Not with this group." Her jaw tightened. "That's not what you mean." He finally met her eyes, and for a moment, the piano between them felt like a chasm. "It's not personal, Lyra." But it was. Of course it was. She could see it in the way he held himself, slightly pulled back, arms crossed not defensively, but protectively. He wasn't rejecting the arrangement. He was rejecting the closeness it would demand. The risk. The exposure. She felt heat rise in her chest, a quiet, sharp burn of embarrassment and something sharper. "You think I'm not ready?" His expression faltered. She wished he had denied it. Wished he had told her she was wrong, that it was about logistics or rehearsal time. But instead, he said nothing, and that silence was louder than anything else. She gathered her papers without another word and walked out, her breath shallow, violin case clutched too tightly in her hand. That night, she didn't eat, didn't sleep, just sat on the floor of her apartment with the arrangement spread across the carpet, wondering if she had misread everything. Not just the musical cues, the emotional ones, the long glances, the near touch, the text. Had she composed intimacy out of silence? Had she mistaken professionalism for something personal? The next few rehearsals passed with mechanical precision. Julian was present, punctual, polite. So was she. But their rhythm had fractured. Their duets became transactional. Their shared silences were no longer spaces filled with meaning, just air between two people who weren't speaking. The students didn't notice at first. But then the conductor stumbled over a time signature. The cellists began to second-guess their crescendos. The ensemble's energy thinned. The music was still there, but its soul had retreated. Lyra knew the group mirrored her and Julian's dynamic more than either of them wanted to admit. And what was worse, she missed him. Not the pianist. Not the partner. Him. The person who noticed when she was tired. Who remembered how she liked her tea. Who played Debussy when he thought she wasn't listening. Finally, it was Julian who broke the pattern. Late one evening, long after the students had gone home and the moonlight slanted through the stained glass windows, He knocked on her office door. She almost didn't answer. But when she opened it, he held a crumpled page in his hand. Her arrangement.
The same one he had dismissed.
I played it, he said quietly. It works. It's beautiful. She stared at him, unsure how to feel. He ran a hand through his hair, uncharacteristically restless. I panicked. Not because of the music. Because of what it felt like to play with you again. She sat down slowly, her heart a tight, strange knot. He continued. You were always better at expressing things through sound. I was the one who hid behind structure. She didn't interrupt. Just let him speak. Playing that piece, it felt like the last time we played together. Before you left. Her voice was quiet. I didn't leave. I broke. He nodded, eyes lowered. I know. And I didn't come after you. That, more than anything, unraveled her. Because it was true. He had watched her fall, literally and figuratively, and done nothing. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear. And maybe shame. The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was raw. He sat beside her. Not close. Not touching. But there. And after a while, she whispered, I thought you hated me. He laughed, soft, pained. I admired you so much it scared the hell out of me. For a long time they just sat there. Not resolving. Not forgiving. But rehearsing how to be around each other again. And in that quiet, Lyra reached out, slowly, placing the sheet music between them.
Let's try it, she said.
And when he nodded, it felt like the first honest note in weeks. The center was quiet in the way theaters always are the night before something important. Not silent, but expectant, as if the walls themselves held their breath in the lull between preparation and applause. Lyra walked the empty aisles of the recital hall barefoot, heels long abandoned by the door, her fingertips grazing the edges of each seat like she was counting ghosts. Tomorrow, this space would be filled with bodies and sound, programs clutched between nervous fingers, old teachers sitting beside former students, and, if all went well, the first standing ovation the Willowfern Art Center had seen in over a decade. But tonight, it was just her, the distant hum of a barely working heater, and the weight of everything unspoken still strung taut between her ribs. She stood on stage for a moment, alone, violin resting in her hands like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. She had played every day for the last week, slowly regaining the muscle memory that had once felt sacred. Her wrist no longer shook, her timing no longer faltered, and her breath, always the traitor, had begun to sink again with the rise and fall of the bow. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about presence. About reclaiming something she had once buried beneath performance anxiety and disappointment and the unforgiving ache of being a young prodigy expected never to fail. Julian found her there, of course. As she'd known he would. He always seemed to appear when her defenses were lowest, not to tear them down, but to sit beside them and wait patiently until she was ready to dismantle them herself. He carried no music, no clipboard, just himself. His hands were in his coat pockets, and he looked, as always, like he was wrestling with a phrase he couldn't quite put into melody. She raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He stepped closer, sat beside the edge of the stage, then said, simply, "They're ready. But I'm not sure I am." It surprised her, that vulnerability, not because she thought him incapable of it, but because he had always seemed to carry it so privately, like a note tucked deep into the lining of a well-worn jacket. She offered a soft smile. "You've been ready for years. You just stopped letting yourself believe it." He looked up at her then, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, not admiration, not longing, but recognition. Of her strength, of her fear, of her. They spoke for hours. Not about the performance, not about the students or the tempo markings or even the weather. They spoke about the years they missed. About the college auditions neither of them attended. The recitals they skipped. the people who disappointed them, the versions of themselves they had abandoned. And in the middle of that conversation, when neither of them expected it, Julian asked, "What would have happened if you hadn't fallen?" It was a cruel question, but she knew he didn't mean it cruelly. She stared at her violin, tracing the edge of the wood with one thumb. "I would have left anyway. I just would have done it faster." He blinked. "You don't miss it?" She inhaled. "I miss the part where it felt like magic, not the part where I had to prove it." Her voice cracked slightly. "I miss playing with you." The admission settled between them like a final chord. He reached out slowly, not toward her hand, but toward the violin. "Then let's give them that. One last time. Just for us." She handed him the music, and they walked to the center of the stage. No audience. No lights. Just the two of them, and the echo of their shared silence.
He sat at the piano.
She raised the bow, and they played, not for practice, not for perfection, but for memory. The duet began hesitantly, like a letter written after years of absence. Each note carried weight, apology, affection, understanding, layered into the phrases like ink between pages. They faltered once, a missed cue, a breath held too long, but neither corrected it. Because the mistakes were theirs, too. Part of the story. Part of the song. By the final measure, they were no longer two musicians reconnecting. They were something else entirely. When the last note faded, Lyra let her hands fall to her side and turned to Julian. "I'm scared for tomorrow," she whispered. He nodded, stepping closer. "So am I." Their foreheads almost touched, but neither of them leaned in. Because this was the night before. The pause.
The breath.
The moment before everything changed. The morning of the performance arrived draped in mist, as if the world itself had paused to watch Willowfern breathe again. The town was uncharacteristically quiet, not in the empty sense, but in the reverent hush that only precedes something meaningful. Outside the art center, folding chairs lined the cobbled street, and handwritten posters fluttered on bulletin boards like eager programs reaching toward unfamiliar hands. Inside, the final hours blurred in a flurry of tuning pegs, coffee cups, stage tape, and last-minute pep talks. Lyra stood in the wings, her fingers flexing over her bow in an endless rhythm, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, not to steady her nerves, but to remember the pulse of her own presence. Julian passed by once, clipboard in hand, and gave her the smallest of nods. Not reassurance, but something stronger.
Belief.
The hall filled fast. The balcony, usually dust-covered and unused, hosted old music teachers and skeptical town critics who hadn't attended a student performance in years. Parents whispered in the aisles, children dangled their legs against the seats, and somewhere in the back row, Lyra thought she spotted her mother, but the lights dimmed before she could be sure. A hush fell, not forced, but unanimous. And then the first movement began. It wasn't perfect. There were a few missed entries. A hesitant clarinet in the second measure. Someone dropped a mute backstage. But none of it mattered, because the sound was alive, full of urgency and effort and emotional risk. Julian played with a steadiness she'd never seen in him before, not cold, not restrained, but deliberate, warm, present. He wasn't leading from behind the piano. He was holding them steady. Every glance between movements was a checkpoint. Every phrase was a thread being rewoven. And then the duet. Their duet. The hall seemed to narrow as Lyra stepped into the center, violin tucked close to her chin, bow angled like a secret waiting to be whispered. Julian adjusted his bench. Their eyes met. No cue was given, it wasn't needed. And they began. The first note felt like stepping into sunlight after years in a cellar. The second, like breath rediscovered. Their dynamic moved in quiet waves, not showy, not over-rehearsed. Lived in. The music wasn't about precision anymore. It was about reconciliation, not just between the two of them, but with who they'd once been. Every note layered their past over the present. Teenage tension, shared silence, missed moments, almost kisses. She played the line he used to envy. He responded with the phrase she once dismissed as technically perfect but emotionally flat. Now, it made her eyes burn. They reached the final crescendo not with drama, but with gravity. A stillness that bloomed outward from their instruments and fell like dust over the audience. When the last note faded, they stayed still for a breath too long, eyes still locked, not for effect, but because the moment deserved to linger. And then applause. Real.
Raw.
Rising like a wave that broke against the walls and kept coming. The students stood first. Then the parents. Then the critics. Even the old man who never clapped for anything rose slowly to his feet and nodded once toward the stage, eyes shining. Lyra didn't cry, but her hand trembled as she lowered her violin. Julian reached across the piano, not to shake her hand, not to pull her in, just to press his fingers lightly against hers. That was all. But it was everything. Backstage, the students buzzed, laughter and euphoria tingling in the corridors like confetti. Lyra stepped away from the crowd for a moment, into the quiet of the old practice room where it had all started. She sat on the edge of the chair, letting her body catch up with her heart. And then Julian entered, gently, like a question. No words were exchanged at first. Then he said, "I don't want this to end with the concert." She looked up, slow and steady. "Neither do I." A pause. Long loaded. Then, "So what do we do?" He smiled, soft and crooked. "We rehearse." "For what?" His eyes were serious now. "For whatever comes next." And that night, for the first time, when he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. Not because the performance was over, but because the real music, the one between them, had finally begun. The week after the performance felt strangely suspended, not anticlimactic, but gently surreal, as though reality had softened its edges to make room for something more intimate. The applause was over. The seats were empty again. The programs had been packed away in cardboard boxes. But Willowfern had changed, subtly. More people wandered past the art center during the day, peeking through the glass doors as if trying to catch leftover echoes. Volunteers came forward to help preserve the building. Someone donated fresh lights for the main hall. The town, which had once moved at the pace of memory, now moved with quiet purpose. And in the center of it all, Lyra and Julian began what neither of them wanted to name too quickly, a second movement. It began in small ways. Julian walked her home more often, sometimes in silence, sometimes trading observations like old songs about the way fog gathered on certain corners of the street, or how the bricks in the bakery still smelled faintly of cinnamon at night. Lyra started leaving the light on in the practice room past hours, not for rehearsals, but for him, a sign, an invitation, a ritual. They didn't talk about what they were, only about what they were doing, a new student showcase for winter, possible summer workshops, maybe even an outreach program to bring younger kids into music early. But their plans were laced with a softness that had nothing to do with logistics. One evening, he showed up at her flat unannounced with takeout from the one cafe that stayed open past 8. She opened the door, surprised, and he held up the bag like an offering. "I forgot to eat. Figured you probably did too." She let him in without hesitation, and they sat on her rug, floor lamp dimmed to amber, eating in companionable silence. At some point, he pointed to the dusty case leaning against her bookshelf. "Still playing?" She nodded. "More than I used to. Less than I want to." He smiled. "That's a good place to be." They started meeting outside the center. A bookstore. A walk. A concert in the city. Just the two of them in the back row, passing a flask of hot tea between their knees like teenagers. Nothing was rushed. Nothing needed to be declared. And still, something bloomed between them. Not passion, not yet, but something more durable, more deliberate. A kind of trust that had been earned not through grand gestures, but through repetition, rhythm, restraint. A duet without urgency. A slow crescendo. It wasn't all easy. One night, Lyra left the room suddenly after a student asked if she'd ever considered auditioning again. She had excused herself calmly, but Julian found her minutes later, standing alone in the courtyard, hands clenched. She didn't cry, didn't speak, but when he reached out to take her hand, she let him. They stood like that for a long time, shoulder to shoulder, her head eventually resting against his. He didn't ask her to explain.
She didn't need to.
Another evening, while sorting music in the basement archive, he stumbled upon one of her old journals, forgotten between concert programs and cracked vinyls. It was full of sketches, rehearsal notes, and one line circled in blue ink. One day, I want to play without fear again. He didn't show it to her, just slipped it into her violin case with a bookmark. The next day, she found it, and when she looked at him, he only said, "You already are." The word relationship never came up. Neither did dating or more than friends. But they both knew. It lived in the way she handed him tea with both hands. The way he always stood slightly too close, yet never made her flinch. The way they said goodnight with too much quiet and not enough distance. And then one evening, after the center had emptied and the sky was clear enough to see stars between the rooftops, he kissed her. There was no lead-up, no dramatic music. Just a glance held 1 second too long. A hand brushing hers. And then his mouth was on hers, careful, questioning, reverent, like a note finally allowed to be played. She kissed him back with the same deliberate ache, like she had been practicing the moment for years in silence. They didn't speak afterward. They didn't need to. But as they parted ways that night, Julian whispered, "We're still rehearsing, right?" She smiled. "Always." Winter settled over Willowfern not with thunder but with hush, a soft blanket of frost on windowsills, the low hum of radiators clicking to life, and the breath of the town drawn in just a little closer. The Arts Center remained warm through it all, lights on later than usual, laughter drifting into the street at odd hours, and the faint sound of music leaking from the rehearsal hall where Lyra and Julian often stayed long after everyone else had gone home. They weren't a secret, nor were they a spectacle. Just two people learning how to coexist inside something as fragile and changing as love. It didn't need labels. It had already survived too much for that. On the first snow of December, Lyra found herself alone in the center, sorting through a donation of sheet music from an old friend of her grandmother's. Most of it was dusty, brittle, aged. But tucked near the bottom of the box was something else entirely, a composition labeled Untitled for two. The melody was unfamiliar.
Sparse.
Unfinished. As if it had been written for someone to complete, rather than to perform. She turned the page over and found a single sentence on the back. "The last bar is yours." She didn't ask Julian before sharing it. She just placed it on the stand one night, without preface, and began playing the first line. He joined in without hesitation, like he'd known the piece his whole life. The music was unpolished, modest, but every note felt like an invitation, every rest like a breath drawn together. They didn't talk about where the composition came from. They didn't need to. They already knew the answer. It didn't matter. It was a reflection of where they were now, building something from the incomplete, playing not for applause or legacy, but for themselves. Their relationship continued in slow, deliberate cadence. No declarations. No drama. Just presence. He would bring her warm bread in the mornings from the cafe. She would slip notes into the margins of his sketches. They argued sometimes about chord progressions, about scheduling, once about whether hot chocolate should be made with water or milk, but the arguments never stayed long. They existed like dissonant chords that found their resolve. They learned each other's silences, their habits, their ghosts. And though neither ever said it outright, they were safe in each other. Not because nothing would ever go wrong, but because when it did, they would stay. Lyra didn't audition again. She didn't need to. The music was enough now, teaching it, sharing it, living inside it without the pressure of being perfect. Julian's compositions became more fluid, more generous. He began submitting pieces under both their names. At first she protested, then accepted. Quietly, gratefully. A year passed. Then two. The art center was renovated, slowly, lovingly, thanks to local funding and a few anonymous donors who kept showing up just in time. The walls were repainted. The stage was expanded. The back room where Lyra first reopened her violin case became a memory, replaced with a studio they jokingly called Second Movements. And every year, in December, they played the unfinished piece, still untitled, still mutable, changing the last bar slightly each time. A new note. A softer resolve. A pause where there used to be none. One evening, after a particularly rich rehearsal, Julian turned to her and asked, "Do you think we'll ever finish it?" She shook her head, smiling faintly. Some songs aren't meant to end. They sat together, side by side on the edge of the stage, feet dangling over the edge, watching the dust swirl in the stage lights. And as the snow fell silently outside, they began to play again. Not as rivals, not as prodigies, not even as performers, but as people who had once been broken, and who, together, had found music in the pieces. Years passed not as chapters, but as variations, soft refrains of seasons repeating with slight changes, quiet evolutions only noticeable when Lyra looked up from her work and realized the students were new again, younger each year, full of the same fear and fire she once carried in her own bones. The Willowfern Art Center had become something more than a workplace, more than a place to play music. It had become an anchor, for her, for Julian, for the entire town. Children learned to read notes there before they learned to write essays. Retired musicians volunteered for joy rather than prestige. Music spilled from its walls like light through stained glass, not sacred, but meaningful. And Lyra found, to her surprise, that the quieter life she had once feared was now the one she could never leave. Julian remained constant, not static, but steady, a rhythm she could rest against, someone who knew her not just from memory, but from attention.
He still drew.
Still wrote music. Still brewed tea exactly 2 minutes longer than necessary. They had built a life together like musicians compose, note by note, day by day, sometimes discordant, always returning to harmony. He never asked her to change. She never asked him to speak more than he could. But in small ways, they rewrote the narrative that had once threatened to define them. Not by erasing the past, but by composing beyond it. On the 5th anniversary of the winter concert, the community held a celebration, not a performance, just an evening of gratitude. Students played solo pieces. Past alumni returned with coffee and stories. Lyra stood in the back, unnoticed at first, watching it all with a kind of quiet awe. One of the students, a girl no older than 12, stood on the stage with trembling fingers and announced that she would be playing a piece called For Two, Incomplete. The room hushed. Lyra's heart skipped. It was the piece. The one she and Julian had played every winter, never titled, never finished. She turned to him, and his expression mirrored hers. Surprised, proud, a little undone. They hadn't programmed it. The students had learned it on their own. Passed it around like folklore, played it slightly differently each time, as was tradition. The girl played slowly, imperfectly, but with care, and when she reached the final bar, she paused, looked out toward the room, and said, "They told me it's up to me how to end it." And then she played a new final chord. Not better, just hers. The room exhaled. Julian slipped his hand into Lyra's. Later that night, as snow fell again in the quiet way it always seemed to do in Willowfern, Lyra and Julian returned to the empty hall one last time. Not for a concert. Not for tradition. Just to sit in the silence. The piano was still warm from earlier. Her violin rested beside her. And, without speaking, they played the original version again, just the two of them.
Slow.
Unadorned. Uninterrupted. Halfway through, Lyra stopped playing. Not because she'd forgotten the notes, but because she didn't need them anymore. She turned to Julian. He was still playing. She leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "Even if we forget this one day, the music won't." And he replied, "That's why we write it down." And so the song lived on, not because it was finished. Thank you for joining us on this journey of silence, memory, and slow-burning love. If this story struck a chord with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes in second chances. Because some love stories aren't loud. They're quiet, patient, waiting, just like a song you almost forgot, until someone plays the final note. Musical score will see you in the next story. But because it never needed to be.